Here is the follow-up to last week's review of D. This week we look at the spiritual successor, Enemy Zero. Enemy Zero was released in Japan in late 1996 and a year later in North America and Europe. It was a pretty big deal because it was a Sega Saturn exclusive and was vastly superior to D in just about every single way. Why I say this is the spiritual successor to D is because, well, the game shares the same protagonist. Okay, sort of. In D, the main character was a woman named Laura Harris, and in this one, it's a lady named Laura Lewis. The two games aren't directly related to one another, except that the lead character just so happens to be named Laura. The thing is, the two games do share a lot in common in terms of gameplay. Once again, this is an FMV game, except there are areas that are real-time action-based. As a matter of fact, the game is directly broken up into two parts. One is the adventure style from D, where you solve puzzles and the like, and the other is a hybrid first-person shooter unlike any you've ever played before. Alright, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's start with the story. Much like D, this is a very heavy story-based game. You play as Laura, who is on a space station doing biological research. She's in cryosleep when an alarm breaks out and the computer automatically wakes her up. Confused as to what's going on, she contacts one of her teammates, Parker, only to watch as he's brutally murdered by an invisible assailant. She quickly gets dressed and hightails it to Parker's room. And pretty much, that's where you come in. The early portions of the game are pretty much identical to D, where you move from one room to the next, and each action you take is played out as an FMV. Once you make your way to a hallway, though, the game switches to a real-time first-person shooter, where you can zip along at a quick pace, strafe, and more. Only problem is, you don't have a weapon. About an hour to an hour and a half into your adventure, you find said weapon, but it's not like anything you've ever used before. Instead of being a typical gun, you need to charge up this weapon before it fires a single shot, and it only fires about 1 foot in front of you. If you miss your target, you have to charge it up all over again. Oh, and it has a battery too, that depletes rather quickly, and thereby forcing you to find a charge station, of which there aren't many. In fact, many gameplay elements are based on charging things. For example, your voice recorder, which is how you save your progress and load your game, has a battery. If you play on beginner, you start with the battery at 100%, but playing on the harder difficulty settings reduces the battery's strength or charge significantly. Every single time you save or load your game, you consume a bit of the charge. And eventually, if you save too often or load too often, you'll run out of energy. Now, this energy cannot be recharged. If you run out of energy while in-game, you will have to complete the rest of the game without saving. Die, and it's game over forever, since you don't have the power to load back into your game. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. If you run out of energy on your voice recorder, you have to restart the whole game again. Needless to say, this is an ingenious way of forcing you not to save often and to conserve your energy as much as possible, so don't die often. Thankfully, the 3-disc adventure isn't overly long. The real-time first-person elements are extremely unique and absolutely terrifying because enemies are invisible. That's right, invisible. And while that makes for some truly nail-biting moments, it also makes for an incredibly boring review as you don't actually see me engage in battle. I either kill the enemy or it kills me. Simple as that. Laura doesn't have a health meter, so if you miss with your first shot, it's automatically game over. So how do you shoot something you can't see? Well, thankfully, there's an audio cue that plays out in the form of a beeping sound. As you make your way through the real-time portions, you will hear more and more beeping noises which clue you in to the number of enemies around you and how close they are. Once they're literally on top of you, that's when you whip out your gun, charge it up, and fire. Miss, and you die. forcing you to load and thereby use energy on your voice recorder. There is a training mode, but even so, I recommend people play this on beginner at first and then slowly ease into the higher difficulty settings. For the beginning portions of the game, you really have to sneak by the invisible enemies to proceed, as if they find you, you die. If you accidentally go into an area where you can't make a break for an exit, you die. Basically, you have to play smart, or, you guessed it, you die. Now this may sound extremely tiresome or complex, but really it's not. It combines the adventure aspects of D with a really creative way of progressing from one area to the next. There are also computer terminals you can interact with to unlock new areas of the space station, there's a video phone you can use, and more. All of this plays out like a killer sci-fi movie, and eventually it's just you and these aliens on a giant space station where you're armed with perhaps the weakest weapon around. The audiovisual presentation is far superior to that of D, while the music and audio elements are about on par, except this time around the audio is even more important, as that's your only way of knowing where enemies are located. The music tracks and ambient noises are right up there with D. Oh, but speaking of the soundtrack, I should mention that Kenji Eno didn't compose the music for Enemy Zero, but instead hired Gattaca and the piano composer Michael Nyman to act as the composer for this game. And it's actually a fairly fantastic soundtrack. The graphics look far more advanced though. The 3D elements are fantastic, environments look nice and detailed, and the FMV is great. It looks many years better than D, even though it was developed directly afterwards. Like D, Enemy Zero has some interesting history to it. It was originally developed on the Sony PlayStation, but when Sony dropped the ball with the manufacturing of D, which I explained in my previous review, basically long story short, Acclaim needed 100,000 copies made, and Sony delivered about 28,000. So because of that, Kenji famously switched platforms from the PlayStation to the Saturn. This caused a huge controversy, as everyone said the Saturn wasn't as powerful as the PlayStation in terms of 3D. But looking at this game, you wouldn't really know it, especially for its time. The way Kenji informed the world of this change though was pretty spectacular. It was at a trade show where he showed off the latest trailer, and at the very end of the trailer, the classic PlayStation logo transformed into the Sega Saturn logo. Fumito Ueda, director of Ico, Shadow of the Colossus, and the upcoming Last Guardian, made his video game debut with Enemy Zero, credited as an animator for the game. He had joined Warp sometime during the development of D, based on what I could find. There was also a limited edition of Enemy Zero that was released only in Japan and sold for close to $2,000 US back in 1996. There were only 20 copies made, making it the rarest limited edition ever produced, and by far the rarest Sega Saturn game of all time. Kenji himself hand-delivered the games to the 20 buyers. Well, hand-delivered isn't exactly the truth, as the game came in a giant crate and was actually delivered on a flatbed truck, and included a wide assortment of goodies. The last copy I could find that had actually sold was on Yahoo Auctions Japan, and it fetched $3,400 back in 2009. Today, even the standard North American version of Enemy Zero is extremely hard to find. It pops up on eBay more often than not, but not too often, and fetches between $100 to $200 depending on the condition. Enemy Zero is a very unique game that certainly takes some getting used to because of the two radically different gameplay elements, but once you do get into the game, it's pretty much unlike anything else you'll ever play. It's certainly worth checking out.